You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter at RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans. Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I gotta start this show off with the Trifecta. The Patrick Gallivan interview will come after the Boston Bruins Mount Rushmore. I know I didn't sell the Gallivan interview at the end of yesterday's show. I completely forgot to. I apologize. That's entirely my fault. But look at it this way. It just gives you more of a reason to follow me on Twitter at RealJacobValk for the latest news when it comes to this show. That's pretty good how I turned that into a piece of self-promotion. Alright, it's time to recap the Las Vegas Raiders 2020 NFL Draft Class. The Raiders had a terrible draft. There is no other way to say it. They had an abysmal draft. I don't understand what the plan is. I mean, it makes really zero sense what they did. They had 7 picks in the draft. None of them came after the 4th round. I like that. That's not what I'm knocking. I'm knocking the players they took. Now, they're good players, but there were better options available. To take Henry Ruggs over Jerry Jeudy and CeeDee Lamb is nothing short of criminal. That's an Al Davis pick. I remember when the Raiders took Darius Hayward-Bay over Michael Crabtree. Now, Michael Crabtree didn't turn into Jerry Rice or anything, but he had a much better career than Hayward-Bay. That's what this reminded me of. Look, I like Ruggs. I think Ruggs is going to be a solid player. He's not going to be great. How do you take him over Jeudy and Lamb? It was one of the stupidest picks of the first round. The Broncos and Cowboys had to be doing backflips when they saw that. Ruggs was at Alabama with Jeudy. I can't think of a single game where Ruggs was better than Jeudy. I understand that they play different games. Ruggs is more of a slot receiver. Judy's more of an outside receiver. But even then, the pick makes no sense. The Raiders already have Hunter Renfrow. I like Renfrow a lot. He's their slot receiver. Are they going to put Ruggs on the outside? Are they going to put Renfrow on the outside? You've got to be kidding me. That was one of the stupidest picks in the whole draft. And then they doubled down on it by taking Damon Arnett. Look, I like Arnett. I think Arnett is going to be a good player in the NFL. But to take him over guys like Trayvon Diggs, Christian Fulton, and Jeff Gladney is criminal. And even then, none of those guys were top 20 prospects. The Raiders reached desperately for a cornerback. They really didn't need a cornerback. They needed a safety. Xavier McKinney would have made perfect sense here. There's a famous clip of Mel Kiper saying it's pretty clear that the Jets don't understand what the draft's all about when they took Jeff Lageman over Hartley Dykes. First up, Lageman was the correct pick. But second up, we can say that about Gruden and Mayock. They're two very smart people, but they didn't do a great job the year before. They reached desperately for Clelin Ferrell. And now they're doing it here. A huge reach for Arnett. It's okay if you want Arnett. Believe me, I understand it. Jumped off the tape at OSU. Really good cover skills. Great tackler. I understand that he's going to give Paul Gunther some extra flexibility. But to take this guy over Diggs, Fulton, and Gladney is criminal. It's nothing short of criminal. They're the ones who don't understand what the draft's all about, not the Jets. In the third round, the Raiders took Lynn Bowden Jr. out of Kentucky. I like Bowden. Stepped in as Kentucky's quarterback when their other quarterbacks got hurt, and Bowden was exciting. Watched him play a lot. Had some good Wildcat moments, and you could tell that he had a future in the NFL in a Brad Smith type role. I had an early 4th round grade on him. But the Raiders already took a wide receiver in Ruggs. Why are they taking one in Bowden? Makes 0 sense. There's literally no good explanation to have double dipped here. You had a huge need on the D-line. Bowden and Ruggs are very similar players. They're both future slot receivers. Is Bowden worse than Ruggs? Yes. 100%. But if they're both going to make it in the NFL, that's how they're going to make it. And to add him to a wide receiver core that already has Hunter Renfrow, Tyrell Williams, and Zay Jones and Nelson Aguilar, I just don't understand it. And to make matters worse, the pick after. Bowden was picked 80th overall. At 81 overall, the Raiders triple-dipped at wide receiver by taking Bryan Edwards. At least Edwards is a true outside receiver. So, I'll give the Raiders credit for mixing it up there. I had a late 3rd round grade on Edwards. I'm not knocking the player. I'm knocking the fact that they triple-dipped at wide receiver. There's literally no good reason for that. The only team that I could have excused doing that would have been the Eagles. I liked Edwards' frame, jumped off the tape at South Carolina, physical player, doesn't get bullied when going up for jump balls. The thing is, he's not a great route runner, and sometimes he gets a case of the dropsies. But that's stuff that can be coached. Nothing against Edwards, but to take him after you took 2 other wide receivers is criminal. There's no other word for it. There's no other way to say it other than the Raiders just don't understand what the draft's all about. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's true. Tanner Muse at the end of the 3rd round at least made some sense. I mean, this is a guy who I had a mid to late 4th round grade on. I'm not going to kill the Raiders too much for that. I mean, they really needed a safety. To take him in the compensatory part of the 3rd round is fine. Muse has a fantastic frame, played really well at Clemson, smart player, good in run support. The thing is, he's not a free safety. He's a strong safety. He's not the guy who you want playing center field in the secondary. But I can live with that. The Raiders did need safety help. Demarius Randall and Jeff Heath aren't going to get the job done anymore. I think Muse has an opportunity to start right away. I didn't mind that pick. I didn't love that pick. It was a little bit of a reach. Not too much. But it was a little bit of a reach. Overall, I like the pick, though. I will say that. John Simpson is a guy who I had a late 4th round grade on. Jack of all trades, master of none. The thing is, when he was at the combine, he really underwhelmed. He's not that athletic. He did really bad in the 40-yard dash, really bad in the 20-yard shuttle. I understand that that doesn't matter to some people, but the NFL is transitioning towards having really athletic offensive linemen. I knew Simpson was going to slip out of day 2. He has day 2 talent, but his athleticism really knocked him down my board. I like Simpson. He can contribute in the next level, and he gives the Raiders some insurance if they decide to move on from Gabe Jackson, which has been rumored for a long time. Amik Robertson has all the talent in the world. I really liked watching him at Louisiana Tech. If we were going off talent alone, he'd probably be a 2nd rounder, maybe even a 1st rounder. The thing is, though, he's 5'8", 187 pounds. Even for a nickel corner, that's short. He also had surgery in January to repair a groin injury. He didn't work out at the combine. That knocked his grade down. I had a high 3rd round grade on him. He has all the talent in the world. Great ball skills. Smart player. Can keep up with receivers. Is he bad in run support? Yeah, but you know how I feel about corners and tackling. I like that the Raiders got him in the compensatory part of the 4th round. That was a fantastic steal by the Raiders, but they already drafted Damon Arnett. Arnett and Robertson are similar in terms of where you're going to have to play him. I don't think Arnett can play on the outside. He's 5'11". It's possible he can, but that's a risky bet. To take another short corner, I didn't like that part of it. All in all, the first 4 picks for the Raiders made absolutely no sense. The last 3 picks made some sense, but even then I can find issues with them. I can't give this draft any better than a C-. And even then, I have half a mind to give him a D or an F. The only reason I'm giving him a C- is because they had 2 good 4th round picks. And the compensatory pick in the 3rd round, Muse, was good too. Alright, it's time for this day in sports history. On this day, my mother was born, and she is a gymnastics fan. That has been this day in sports history. No. I'm only kidding. That's not going to be this day in sports history, but happy birthday, Mom. On this day, in 2007, Clete Boyer passed away at the age of 70. I'm a big Yankees fan, you know this, so indulge me a little bit. There were a bunch of different routes I could have gone, but I went with Boyer because he's really unknown to the casual baseball fan. It's okay if you don't know a lot about him. Overshadowed by guys like Berra and Mantle and Maris and Whitey Ford, but Boyer was one of the best defensive players of his era. If you know anything about Yankee history, you'll know that the Kansas City Athletics were basically a farm team for the Yankees. Guys like Bob Serve, Ralph Terry, and Roger Maris were all former Athletics. And then they were sent to the Yankees by Park Carroll, Athletics GM. Why this happened, there are really a bunch of explanations. It's well known that Carroll had a really good relationship with Del Webb. Del Webb was a co-owner of the Yankees at that time, along with Dan Topping. But you look at some of those trades, I mean, you've got to wonder what Carroll was smoking. Helped reinforce the Yankee teams of the early 60s. Boyer was a bonus baby. A guy who signed straight out of high school for a lot of money. And it took him a while to get going. With the Athletics, he was not good. In his 3 seasons there, he only played 124 games, hit .226, and didn't flash the glove that he'd later become so famous for. But then Boyer got sent to the Yankees in a huge deal. It was actually part of the Bobby Shantz deal. But Boyer took a little bit before he got really established. In 59, he didn't play a lot for the Yankees, only 47 games. Hector Lopez was their starting third baseman, and he wouldn't move to left field until Norm Seaburn was traded as part of the Roger Maris trade. So that's how Boyer got his shot. When Lopez moved over to left, Boyer took over at third. While Boyer was never great with the bat, he flashed the leather constantly. Only made 11 errors at third all year. And in the World Series against the Pirates, he hit .250. Casey Stengel actually wasn't a huge fan of Boyer because he didn't like that Boyer couldn't hit. In fact, there's actually an obscure moment in that World Series where in the second inning, not the ninth inning, the second inning, 2 runners on, Yankees down 3-1, Stengel pinch hit Boyer for Dale Long, who would later fly out to Roberto Clemente. So Boyer started the game, but he never got an at-bat. He didn't play in that World Series again until Game 6, but even then, to hit .250, that's not terrible in a World Series. And in limited time, that makes it that much more impressive. In 61, he continued to flash the leather, was an underrated part of their World Series run. In the World Series, he had .267 with 3 RBIs had a .421 on base percentage. I know that didn't mean anything back then, but still though, he got on base 8 times in 15 at-bats. That's pretty darn good. And in 62 against the Giants, Boyer had his best postseason, hitting .318 with 1 home run and 4 RBIs. He also had his best regular season as a hitter for the Yankees, as he hit .272 with 18 homers and 68 RBIs. He was an integral part of a great Yankee infield defense. Boyer, as I established, was great defensively, but so was the shortstop Tony Kubek and the second baseman Bobby Richardson. I mean, if you know your Yankee history, you know Game 7 of the 1962 World Series, Willie McCovey hits a shot right to Richardson. He barely has to move, and he snares it for the out. There were very few second basemen around at that time that could have made that catch, that had those reflexes. He was positioned perfectly for that ball. Just epitomizes how great that Yankee defense was on the infield. After 62, though, his career kind of took a dip. In 64, Yogi Berra was the manager. The team didn't play as well as it could have. Boyer drastically underachieved. Yes, the Yankees made it to the World Series, but they lost to the Cardinals. Yankees move on from Yogi Berra, replace him with Johnny Keane. Keane was disastrous for the Yankees. And Boyer's career with the Yankees ended in this climate of horror for the Yankees. I mean, they were finishing dead last. CBS was putting no money into the team. Keane barely lasted 2 seasons as Yankees manager, was replaced by Ralph Houck. Houck did the best he could, but I mean, you take a look at those rosters, there's only so much you could do. Boyer got sent to the Braves and would actually hit cleanup behind Hank Aaron. A guy who only had 96 home runs to his name was hitting cleanup. Think about that. But it worked, as his first season there, 1967. Boyer hit .245 with 26 homers and 96 RBIs. In 1969, Boyer won his only Gold Glove. He hit .250 that year with 14 homers and 57 RBIs. You're probably wondering, well, Jacob, how good was he in the field if he only won 1 Gold Glove? Well, he was playing behind Brooks Robinson. Kinda hard to win Gold Gloves when you're going up against Brooks Robinson. As great as Boyer was in the field, he wasn't Robinson. Robinson was nicknamed Hoover for a reason. Not because of the president, because of the vacuum. That was really his last great moment on the diamond. In 71, he got into a really, really bad feud with Braves GM Paul Richards and manager Lum Harris. Boyer didn't like that his teammates couldn't field, they weren't being taught the fundamentals. Boyer was labeled a troublemaker, and he was released. He would play in Japan for a little bit, which I actually didn't know. Thank you, Wikipedia. Boyer would make it back to the Yankees as a third base coach under Billy Martin. History hasn't stated how great of a third base coach Boyer was, but he's a guy who preached the fundamentals. There's no question about that. Kind of interesting to think about how responsible Boyer was for a guy like Greg Nettles succeeding with the Yankees as a defensive third baseman. After baseball, he opened up a restaurant in Cooperstown that I've actually been to, Clete Boyer's Hamburger Hall of Fame. I have no idea if it still exists, but I do remember going there. He named a bunch of sandwiches and burgers after former Yankees. He was at the restaurant a lot. Unfortunately, I didn't meet him. I think I was there after he died in 2007 at the age of 70 from a brain hemorrhage. He was cremated and his ashes were placed in a Yankees urn. I can't think of a better way to have stored his ashes. May he rest in peace. Alright, it's time for another Mount Rushmore. We're on the Boston Bruins now, the first original six team that I'm gonna do, and this one was harder than you'd think. Because I'm sure you can think of some great Boston Bruins. Bobby Orr, Ray Bourque, Cam Neely, Johnny Busick, Phil Esposito, Rick Middleton, Wayne Cashman. But what about the goalies? Tuukka Rask, Tiny Thompson, Frank Brimsek, Jerry Cheevers. This is the hardest Mount Rushmore to do for hockey by far. Not even close. Ultimately, though, I think I came up with a good one. The correct Mount Rushmore is Bobby Orr, Ray Bourque, John Busick, and Tuukka Rask. I wanted a goalie in there. I really, really wanted a goalie. Bobby Orr, you don't need me to tell you about him. Greatest defenseman in NHL history, regarded by some as the best player in NHL history. For my money, he's the third best skater in NHL history, behind only Gretzky and Howe. Or has to be at the top of your Bruins Mount Rushmore. Ray Bourque continued that Bruins legacy of having a great offensive defenseman. It's kind of interesting to think about who was the better offensive defenseman at the time, Bourque or Potvin. My fandom would tell you Potvin, but my brain would probably tell you Ray Bourque. This guy was a 19-time All-Star, a 5-time Norris Trophy winner. Without question, one of the best defensemen in NHL history. John Busick spanned two eras. The end of the original six era to the Bobby Orr era. And it wasn't until Bobby Orr got there that he won his 2 Stanley Cups. But he was great in those playoffs. Fantastic player, one of the best players of his era. Gentlemanly player. 2-time Lady Byng winner. Placed in the top 3 of Lady Byng voting 7 times. And in the top 2, 6 times. And Tuukka Rask has been a stalwart in net for the Bruins ever since he took over for Tim Thomas. I understand that there are some Bruins fans that would put a guy like Jerry Cheevers or Frank Brimsek or Tiny Thompson over Rask, but Rask is going to get 300 wins next year, all with the Boston Bruins. He's been one of the best goalies in the NHL ever since he took over for Tim Thomas. Is probably going to win the Vezina this year. I would really need to think about it. I haven't dug too deep into awards for the NHL or the NBA, but off the top of my head, I can't think who would be ahead of Rask. Rask is my pick here. I understand that there are some people that would put Phil Esposito or Cam Neely or Ricky Middleton or Wayne Cashman there in that final spot, but I just couldn't. Could have made a second Mount Rushmore very easily, I'll tell you that. Alright, here's my exclusive interview with Patrick Gallivan. You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be joined by Patrick Gallivan, the author of Pro Football in the 1960s, the NFL, the AFL, and the Sports Coming of Age. Patrick, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing today, Jacob?
I'm doing good. So, what's something that most people don't know about Vince Lombardi's Packers?
Wow. There's one interesting story I have that comes from the 60s. It comes from the Ice Bowl. If everybody remembers the Ice Bowl, that was a dramatic game that came down to the last few seconds with the Packers and the Cowboys. And the Packers had the ball right on the 1-yard line. They tried to score, but the running backs were slipping because the icy conditions on the field. That was the shady end of the stadium, so the grass was covered in almost ice. And so they called a timeout, 20 seconds left. They're trailing again by 3, 17-14, and Bart Starr comes to the sidelines. Most people have probably heard the story about that Bart Starr likes to tell, where he suggested that he run the ball on a quarterback sneak because his footing was better than the running backs, and Lombardi said, then run it, and let's get the hell out of here. And so what people may not remember is that when they came back to play, the camera in the telecast was focused in on Bart Starr, calling signals, getting ready to call the ball. The producer and the cameraman had coordinated that as soon as he snaps the ball, swing the camera real fast out to the receiver because we expect a pass. With only 20 seconds left, probably a lot of people in the stadium expected a pass. You could probably get 2 plays off with a pass because an incomplete would stop the clock. But a running play might just finish off the game before they could snap the ball again. Instead, maybe with the element of surprise, Bart Starr calls the sneak. He follows Jerry Kramer, who blocks Jethro Pugh, and the touchdown's made, and it's all in history. Well, what happened is the cameraman's camera froze, and he couldn't pivot it. It couldn't swing it, and so he just did the next best thing and stayed on the quarterback or stayed on the center field, or center of his field was looking at the center of what was going on. And it was history in the making because, of course, they showed that instant replay, which was still new to people at that time. We didn't use that term. You didn't see replays very often. They started in the 60s, and they showed it in the Packer locker room, and Vince Lombardi, a former guard himself, he really got excited when he saw Jerry Kramer make that block, said, way to go, Jerry. And we might have not seen it. If the camera hadn't froze and he switched to the receiver, we might have missed one of the dramatic plays in NFL history. So that's one thing I think of about the Packers and their run. Of course, that game, that victory, clinched 3 in a row for the Packers. It's a lot of sports fans know it's really hard in the NFL to try to win 3 championships in a row. The Packers did in the middle of the 60s when that game won the NFL championship for them against the Cowboys.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't know that Bart Starr's sneak was caught by accident. That's incredible.
Yeah, the call was not an accident because Bart Starr wanted that call, but
right.
Us being able to see it, like we've seen it probably over and over again, was something that happened kind of on an accident because of the frigid conditions. The cameraman couldn't pivot as was planned. Because, producers probably try to predict the play just like we predict the play when we're watching the game at home. And we probably think, Oh, yeah, for sure they're going to throw the ball because then they can get 2 plays in.
Yeah, but we all get it wrong unless our name is Tony Romo.
Yeah, Romo seems to have a way of doing it. Maybe he should have been producing that game.
So we'll switch over to the AFL now. Can you lay out the Oilers teams of the early 60s?
Well, the Oilers had a lot of famous players. Of course, you probably know that the Oilers won the first 2 championships. One of the more famous players that they had on their roster was George Blanda, who we probably remember from the end of his career, towards the end of his career with the Raiders. He was primarily a kicker at that point, but he had played a long time with the Chicago Bears, and the Bears kind of thought he was all washed up. He played a lot of years with them, and then when the new league started, they allowed him to just jump ship and try his wares with the Houston team in the AFL. And he went out and played there, and of course they put together an amazing string because they were one of the strongest teams right off the bat. And they won the first 2 championship games. In fact, there was talk sometime around then of because some of it was probably braggadocio, where people would say, my team can beat your team, and some of the AFL owners were proud of saying, because they knew it would never happen, because the NFL wouldn't take the field against them at that point, but they would puff their chests out and say, my team can beat your team in the NFL. And there was a lot of talk that way that maybe they could or they couldn't. It was like sports talk radio before there was sports talk radio, because you could never prove them right or wrong, because they would just stand up and say they could do it, and we never got to see the game played out. But George Blanda was probably their biggest name on those Houston teams. Quarterback was an important position back then, just like it is today. And like I said, he took them to those first 2 titles in the AFL, and they played the third year too against the other Texas team, the Dallas Texans, and in a really key contest. The 1962 AFL championship game is almost considered, in AFL fans' eyes, like the 58 championship. You remember the 58 championship that went to overtime, and Johnny Unitas led his team back to tie the
greatest game ever played.
Yeah, they call it the greatest game ever played. Well, AFL fans might call the greatest game ever played in their mind, in their league, the 62 title game, because that game was tied up and went to overtime as well. And very exciting game. It was kind of a game at 2 halves, because one team dominated the first team, the second half was dominated by the other team, but back and forth, tied at the end of regulation. They went to overtime, and the team that the Dallas team, the team that ended up moving after that championship to Kansas City, went on to win that game and stopped the Houston Oilers from taking 3 in a row in their league. So, again, a very climatic game. One of the stories you hear from that game is that Hank Stram was on the sidelines, and he knew the weather was getting really, really bad. As I said, it was bad weather condition, almost monsoon in the second half. Wind was terrible, and he just wanted the wind. In overtime, very few people will take the win. They want the ball right away. They want to get that chance to score and get out of there, as Lombardi would say. So he sent his captains out there and said, I want you to kick to the clock. And when they flipped the coin, Houston won the toss, and the referee said, your choice. And they said, we want to kick to the clock. And the referee had no flexibility back in those days. I know we've seen some coin toss miscues here of late in the NFL, but right. He heard the word kick first. And so the Houston team had to kick the ball off, and then they lost the benefit of the wind because the other team got to pick what option they wanted, and they took the wind. So for the first part of that overtime period, Houston had to play without the ball first and to face that wind. But it did work out for them as they won the game.
Now, I'm a Jets fan, so
the question that I'm about to ask you really hurts me. We'll get into Super Bowl III in a little bit, but before we do, would you be able to describe the Giants teams of the early 60s?
Okay, yeah, that must be painful for you to ask about the Giants, being a Jets fan. But
yeah.
the Giants were a really strong team in the early part of but they were kind of one of those teams that was like the also-rans. They were in it a lot, in the title game a lot, but they didn't come away with that big title like everybody expected. Like if you remember back 58 and 59, the greatest game ever played was 58, was the Colts against the Giants. They had a repeat of that contest. Both same teams came back in 59. And so the Giants were a team that was always right there on the brink of doing something, but they couldn't quite win the big game and pull off the victory and take the trophy like you might hope for, like if you were a Giants fan. They had a lot of stellar players that you hear a lot about. Y.A. Tittle was one of their players, and Frank Gifford. Yeah, Frank Gifford, who's probably better known now as being an announcer and was on Monday Night Football from year 2 on. He
Alex
was one
Webster,
of their star
Del
players.
Schaffner.
Yeah, they had a great defensive line. Their team was probably paced more on their defense than their offense, even though they had some stars and some guys that got a lot of the media attention on offense. That defensive line was probably the best defensive line in football. They had Sam Huff at linebacker. He was probably one of the first middle linebackers that received a lot of attention. They did that CBS documentary on him with Walter Cronkite, where they wired him for sound, which we hadn't seen much of. Of course, that was in a practice rather than a game because that was considered innovative at that point. And they showed a lot of Sam Huff footage. They had Robustelli and Cat Cavage on the defensive line. A lot of good defensive players on that team. They were kind of the also-rans in the early part of the first part of the decade of the 60s. It's interesting, too, to note that Y.A. Tittle retired, and Y.A. Tittle had the looks of a much older man because he was prematurely bald, and he had gotten beaten up pretty well in his last few years with the Giants. He retired, and into town came the guy you will remember most is Joe Namath. And so that passing of ships came almost the same time, where one retirement happened and an introduction happened, where they introduced Namath, and then the tide started to turn a little bit, where the Jets were able to catch up and do much better than the Giants in the second half of the decade of the 60s.
Yeah, and just to twist the knife a little bit more, in the 3 NFL championship games that the Giants played in the 60s, they only scored a combined 17 points. Just think about that, Giants fans. 17 total points in 3 NFL championship games. That doesn't sound too good to me. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, one of those games was against one of the Packer teams, which was the 1962. Yeah.
And 61.
Yeah, in 61, where they were going, the Packers were going for a three-peat in 63, and that's when Horning was suspended. So it was kind of interesting from that point of view. Another interesting story that you made me think of right just now, with the 62 championship games, the Berlin crisis was going on then, and it looked like Horning wouldn't get to play in that game because with the Berlin crisis, a lot of National Guard members were called up to active duty, and Horning was away from the team, and it looked doubtful that he was going to get released for the weekend on a weekend pass to play in the ball game. And a couple of years before, while a candidate called John Kennedy was stumping for presidential race in the Wisconsin primary, he had met Vince Lombardi. And the story goes that Vince Lombardi was given, or Kennedy gave Vince Lombardi his phone number to say, give me a call sometime if you ever need anything and I'll help you. And so Vince Lombardi immediately thought it's because Kennedy won the presidency. He's the commander-in-chief. I need my star halfback for this football game. And so he made the call, used the phone number, made the call, and lo and behold, Paul Hornung was released in time to make the ball game. And he had a pretty good game, as I recall. He scored a touchdown and kicked a few field goals because he also was a field goal kicker, or a kicker, because back in the early 60s, players had to do more than one thing usually.
Right.
And so it was a good thing he made the call because Hornung had a really good game.
Yeah, that's a pretty good favor to call in, to have the president excuse your star player from active duty.
Yes. Yes. That's using your pull, isn't it?
Exactly. Talking to Patrick Gallivan, the author of Pro Football in the 1960s, the NFL, the AFL, and the sports coming of age. So speaking of President Kennedy, obviously everyone remembers where they were when they heard that President Kennedy had died, and Walter Cronkite delivered the news in one of the most important moments in television history. But one person didn't seem to grasp the importance of that moment. Why did Pete Rozelle have NFL teams play the Sunday after President Kennedy was murdered?
Well, that was a tough decision, and he listened to some of the owners, and some of the owners said play, some of the owners said you'd be crazy to play this game, and then the press secretary, Pierre Salinger, the president's press secretary, and Rozelle were acquaintances from college, and so he placed a call and asked him what he thought he should do, because Rozelle was pretty good about talking to people and sounding out, getting their opinions. Some major colleges had postponed games that year. Some played. Of course, you probably know the AFL. They kept their regular slate of games. But Rozelle took all the input in, and he decided that the Kennedys, being huge football and sports fans, because Kennedy he had the fitness council, and he was big into sports, and you've probably seen pictures and footage of the Kennedy clan playing touch football and on their front lawn. He had a very athletic family. All of them played a lot of sports. John Kennedy had more problems with his back in later years, which prevented him from playing football, but he did a lot of swimming and very into sports. And so the story goes that the Kennedy family would have preferred, they love sports, they would have preferred that he played the game. And that's what Rozelle used as his one of the factors in his decision-making to say, we're going to play the game. And the AFL ran counter to that. The AFL can't postpone their games. They didn't play that weekend. Many sports, like I said, some of the major colleges didn't play that weekend as well, and pushed the games back till after all the funeral and everything, gave people a time to mourn. And as the events were, the planes were getting ready to leave because it happened on a Friday, and so they were getting ready to get to the weekend games, to get to their sites for the games on Sunday. And so as Rozelle was considering it, he also gave some thought to Dallas, which is where Kennedy was assassinated, and Washington, which of course is the nation's capital, were not playing at home that weekend. They were on the road. So he thought that was something in his favor, that he didn't have to play a game. Neither of those cities would have to play a game that weekend. But that weekend, too, right about game time, is when they were moving Lee Harvey Oswald and to move him to another prison where they had been holding him. And that's where that morning is when he was shot. And as it turns out, the news media probably wouldn't have even covered the games because they were locked into the assassination coverage, both footage from Dallas about the assassination of the assassin, but then also the funeral preparation and what was going on with mourning across the country and in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. as well. So that was the decision that Rozelle made. And some have argued that even though it was a decision that was probably his worst, he called it his worst of his whole career, of his 3 decades as commissioner of the NFL, as he looked back. But also, right after that, Sports Illustrated named him Man of the Year for all he had done with the National Football League to keep it growing and everything. So one would argue that maybe it wasn't that big of a black eye for him because he was named Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year right after that decision was made.
Well, look, there's no question that Pete Rozelle is the best commissioner in NFL history, and it was certainly a tough decision. I certainly can't imagine being in his shoes. If that's the worst thing you did in your 20 years as commissioner, that's doing something right, because, it's not something like you're putting a team in the middle of nowhere or you're making disastrous decisions with money or collusion or something like that. So it sort of all worked out in a weird way. So what can you tell us about the Browns teams of the mid to late 60s?
Now, the Browns, if you recall, the Browns were a team that came from the All-American Football Conference, where they had won. That football league was, in some would say, the predecessor of the AFL. It originated in the late 40s at the conclusion of World War II. The Browns dominated that league. It lasted for 4 years, and they won 4 championships in that period of time. They came to the NFL. Back then, the commissioner was Bert Bell. Bert Bell's philosophy on scheduling games was we're going to have the good teams play the good teams right off the bat. He believed that would do a couple of things. If you had the good play the good, maybe the teams that weren't expected to be quite as good would be in the race a little bit longer because they would be playing one another as well. So he was trying to fix it so more teams were in the race longer throughout the season. That was basically the strategy. But when he set up the schedule with those new teams from the AAFC joining the NFL, he decided he'd have the Cleveland Browns play the world champions of the NFL, or play the champions of the NFL in week 1. And then he'd have those 2 teams face off. Well, a lot of the NFL fans said, well, the Cleveland Browns will get to see what real football is all about. And in that week 1 encounter between the Browns and I believe it was the Philadelphia Eagles, the Browns won. And Paul Brown led a lot of innovations throughout football in his time with the Cleveland Browns. He was, some people dispute this, but he's Rodell, the helmet maker, says he invented the face mask. You read their website, they give him credit for that. He had a patent for that. Some people dispute that claim. He also put the earpiece or the transmitter. He used a transmitter because he wanted to call plays. So he wanted to call plays into the quarterback's helmet. So the quarterback's helmet would have a receiver, so he could listen, get the word from the sidelines. They tried that during the exhibition season, and the other teams complained pretty much that they didn't like that idea, him having that unfair advantage as they saw it. And the commissioner said that he couldn't use it anymore. But he was way ahead of his time, as you can expect, because now we take that as commonplace, that coaches on the sidelines would call plays right into the helmet of the quarterback. He was doing it, I believe it was the late 50s that he first introduced that technology to the game. He's also the guy that had the first playbook, and he had classroom settings where he was going to teach football. He was big into instruction and making sure the players understood what was supposed to happen. He wanted them to take notes of what they had to do so that they would learn the plays, and then he would test them. And before each league contest, he would give them a test, and then they would see how well they did. Now, Jim Brown, one of his best players, would say people were cheating like crazy on those tests. They were writing crib notes out and hiding the answers just like a kid might do. And I think Coach Brown looked the other way and said, whatever they got to do to learn the play, my goal is just for them to get the learning done. So that was what he was more interested in. And they were a really, really good team. Curiously, though, Paul Brown was fired by Art Modell in 1963, and right after that is they went to the championship game again. And so it was kind of strange that Paul Brown left and Blanton Collier, his replacement, took the team to the championship game. And you might recall that Cleveland Browns were the opponent of the Baltimore Colts in the championship game prior to Super Bowl III.
Right.
With your Jets. And that was 34-0, where the Browns were beaten. And Baltimore's only loss during the regular season was against Cleveland, and I guess they came with plenty of ammunition to try to settle that score in the championship game.
So let's go to the AFL for a little bit. Can you lay out the Bills teams of the mid-'60s?
Okay, the Bills teams, a lot of people, when they talk about the AFL, they talk about really wide-open play because if you can think back in 1960 and 61, you had a couple of receivers in the AFL catch 100 passes, which was unheard of in those days. Nowadays, we take that as more commonplace because they throw the ball an awful lot. But the AFL was famous for a little bit more wide-open offense. And NFL people would say, well, you played lousy defense. That's why the offense looked so good. So I guess that's the same debate we face today, maybe. But the Buffalo Bills of the middle part of the decade won back-to-back championships in 64 and 65, and they did it with defense and a strong ground game. They had another good defensive line. We talked about the Giants' strong defensive line. They had a guy named Tom Sestak, who probably could have been a Hall of Famer, but he had ran into injury problems, and his career was shortened. He played defensive tackle. And Ron McDowell, who played a long, long time in the NFL, he finished his career with the Redskins, was on the defensive line. They had a strong set of linebackers. Mike Stratton was one of those who was famous for what they called the hit, heard around the globe when he hit Keith Lincoln in the championship game and knocked Keith Lincoln out of the contest. Changed the momentum of the game because the Chargers were doing really well, and that after that hit, the Bills started to dominate. But the Bills played one more on solid defense and not that wide open approach like most of the other AFL teams. People said they looked more like an NFL team. They also had Cookie Gilchrist running the ball. Cookie's probably compared most often to Jim Brown, probably for two reasons. Jim Brown was a big, strong fullback. He was a great athlete. He played lacrosse in college as well, about 6'2" and 230, really strong, really fast. Well, Cookie was somewhat similar in size and dimensions and also very fast. The other commonality that those two guys had with one another, along with being great athletes, they were rather outspoken. If you asked an opinion of either one of them, they were going to give it to you. So, in fact, Cookie Gilchrist ran afoul of Coach Lou Saban of the Buffalo Bills, and that's how he was traded away eventually because Lou Saban got tired of some of his antics and some of the talking he did, and so he got tired of that and shipped him off. But the Bills of the mid-decade, the mid-'60s, solid defense, solid ground game, and they had a quarterback who probably would be called a game manager today. Jack Kemp was their quarterback, later a congressman and a presidential candidate. and he just kept steady leadership over the team. He tried to keep Cookie in line and try to play middleman between Cookie and Lou Saban in a lot of ways, because Saban wanted to suspend him after one particular game, and Kemp went to see both parties and played the mediator and got the coach to change his mind and bring Cookie back on the team, provided he apologized to the rest of his teammates, and he did so. But the Bills, that's how they were built. They were built more like an NFL team. So there was continual debate. Like I said before, just like the talk radio today, a lot of the people, AFL fans, would say our Bills could beat you because they can play your same game. Talking to the Cleveland Browns, Cleveland's real close to Buffalo, so a lot of debate could go back and forth as to which team would win. And of course, Cleveland and Buffalo were probably built a lot of the same way at that time in the mid-'60s.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought exercise to think about who would win, the Browns or the Bills. I don't know. Probably the Browns. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate like that. In fact, there was articles written with that debate going on because I guess people felt comfortable and safe that they could take their position as to who would win. If you were an AFL fan, you probably thought the Bills would beat the Browns. If you were an NFL fan, you probably thought the game's not even going to be close. And so it probably depended on your perspective, where you're from, which side you pulled for, as to what side of that argument you were on. But it's one that we could argue till the sun comes down because it never happened. So we don't really know what would have happened had they played.
Talking to Patrick Gallivan, the author of Pro Football in the 1960s, the NFL, the AFL, and the sports coming of age. So would you be able to describe the Raiders teams of the late 60s?
Of the late 60s, but yeah, they were at the top of the heap in the late 60s because really there's in the AFL towards the end of the decade, every year there was three teams that were up at the top. It was the Chiefs and the Raiders in the West, and it was the Jets with Namath in the East. And so the Raiders acquired Darryl LaMonica, who was a backup at Buffalo, and he got that starting job out there with the Raiders, and he made the most of it because he really aired the ball out. Al Davis is pretty much known to be a person that likes speed. His whole life, he liked speed, and so he had speedy receivers who could really catch the ball. Fred Biletnikoff is probably the most famous of them. He also liked to use his receivers, like Charlie Smith, and throw the ball to them, get them out there on the flank, where they could maybe use their speed and elusiveness to break away a longer run. But the name of the game with the Raiders was speed. They also had a great set of defensive backs led by Willie Brown, and they started. Willie Brown is one of the ones that's famous for starting with the bump and run coverage, where he'd get right up in the face of receivers and try to jam them at the line of scrimmage. That he was one of the first to do that and to do that well. And so he played throughout the 60s. Started with the Broncos, but moved to the Raiders, and did that really well with the Raiders. And like I said, towards the end of the decade, you could figure it's either going to be the Chiefs, the Raiders, or the Jets that win the title. And in fact, those were their first three Super Bowl representatives were in that order. The Chiefs, the Raiders, and the Jets played in the first three Super Bowls, and they were the top of the league at that point in time in the American Football League.
Yeah, I love thinking about those old Jets teams. I've spent enough time talking about other teams. It's time to talk about the 68 Jets, one of my favorite teams ever. What can you tell us about them?
Of course, they were famous for the guy who wore number 12 and threw the ball. That man's name, of course, is Joe Namath. He changed the league a lot. When I look at the 60s, I think the league, all of professional football was dominated by authoritative coaches in the first part of the 60s. You had Paul Brown, who we spoke about. You had Vince Lombardi, who we spoke about. They were really the man. When you talked about either league, it was my way or the highway with those kind of coaches. People didn't ask questions. They just did exactly what those coaches said, or they went elsewhere. And so that's how it was in the early part of the century. It changed, the decade. It changed towards the end of the decade because now you start to see players become more of a star. And that star, the first real star, came with Joe Namath because Joe Namath came along at the perfect opportunity. When he was leaving college, the AFL needed stars. They had just signed a big contract and had money to spend. Sonny Werblin was the owner of the Jets then, and Sonny came from the entertainment business, and he knew that stars were what sold tickets. When you have a Broadway show, you look at whose name is at the top of the poster there. Yeah, and you go to the show because that guy's a star or she's a star or something. And he wanted to bring that same philosophy to professional football with the Jets, and he found his star with Joe Namath. Now, of course, Joe Namath was surrounded by some very good, talented players. Towards the end of the 60s, they had another really solid defense with not as many of the bigger names that you hear as from other teams, perhaps.
Hugely underrated defense. Hugely underrated. Jerry Philbin, Larry Grantham, Johnny Sample, Randy Beverly, Bill Baird. Some of the best defensive players in AFL history. Would you agree with that?
Yes, they were really. They had a really good team. One guy, I don't think you mentioned, John Elliott.
John Elliott, right. I forgot about John Elliott.
Underrated defensive tackle, very quick. Not often that you see a defensive tackle with so many sacks. Philbin, of course, got a lot of attention at the end, but he came in, and I think he was only in his second year in that championship, so he started off really fast and played really well with them. Of course, they had two good running backs too. I always liked their running backs with Emerson Boozer and Matt Snell.
That's why they won Super Bowl III, because Snell was so great in that game.
Right. I think there's a lot of debate afterwards as to who would have been the MVP, because Snell really dominated that game with over 100 yards rushing. He really helped them run more of a ground control game, short passing attack, and the recipient of the short passes was George Sauer, who caught a lot of passes. But a lot of people don't remember is Don Maynard had a bad hamstring in that game. And I don't think he caught a single pass in that Super Bowl III. They threw to him a couple times just to try to stretch the Colts defense, but George Sauer caught most of the passes that afternoon in the Orange Bowl. Curiously, all three receivers for the Jets had Texas connections, because Pete Lamons played at the University of Texas, as did George Sauer. And, of course, Don Maynard grew up in Texas. He went to a school, I believe it was at Texas El Paso. So there was a Texas connection in New York to win that championship in that Super Bowl. But the team, of course, comes down to Namath. Namath was the first quarterback to throw for 4,000 yards. He did it in 1967, and it was done in 14 games because they only played 14 games in those years. So that was almost unheard of at that time, too, that quarterbacks couldn't throw for that many yards in one season. He was the first to do it.
Yeah, and who could forget that offensive line with Winston Hill, a young Randy Rasmussen, John Schmidt, Dave Herman was a Pro Bowler that year. On the other tackle. They had Sam Walton, who was a rookie that year. I mean, just such a great, well-rounded team. Why can't the Jets have that now, Patrick? Can you answer me that? Why can't the Jets have that now?
A lot of Jet fans are probably asking that same thing. And one interesting thing is they moved Dave Herman from guard to tackle in both the game against the Raiders and in the Super Bowl because he replaced Walton, who was a rookie and was struggling a little bit at times towards the end of the season, and they moved Herman out to play that spot and moved Bob Talamini, who came from Houston.
That's right.
The Houston Oilers. Yeah, and they plugged him in at guard, and Dave Herman took on that task, and he played against Bubba Smith in Super Bowl III, and Bubba Smith probably had 3 or 4 inches and maybe 50 or 60 pounds on him. Bubba Smith was an immense defensive end, and Dave Herman was a very capable guard, but he hadn't had much experience at tackle and played really well in both of those games against the Raiders in the AFL Championship game and against the Colts in the Super Bowl.
No question about that. So, one more question on Super Bowl III, and I think you'll appreciate this one. How much did Super Bowl III epitomize the counterculture of the 1960s?
Okay, I think it did a lot for that, because what I try to spell out in a book, I've talked a little bit about how coaches were in charge in the early 60s, and then the players started to get a little more notoriety, a little more of the superstar with Namath in particular at the end of the decade. Well, the same thing you saw in culture generally throughout the 60s, because you had the civil rights movement, you had the Vietnam War protests. Young people in particular, were doing more protesting. They were doing more talking, which the older generation maybe wasn't used to seeing or hearing. And in particular, when Namath showed up at the Super Bowl, he was not bashful at all about answering reporters' questions. So a reporter would say, what do you think about Earl Morrall? Well, Earl Morrall, if anybody was honest, would say he's pretty much a journeyman quarterback, but he had a really spectacular season with the Colts. He looked really good. He was the MVP of the NFL that year, so he had a spectacular season on that Colts team. But he had moved around to 4 different teams prior to that, so he hadn't shown that every season when he was there in the league. And they asked him about it, and he said, Earl Morrall, I can name probably 4 or 5 AFL quarterbacks that are better than he is. And people took that, what are you saying? Why are you bashing Earl Morrall? Well, that wasn't it really. He was just trying to give you his opinion, which in that era, maybe younger people weren't supposed to have so many opinions as Mr. Namath had prior to the Super Bowl. And of course, the big thing that everybody remembers is his guarantee when he stood up at a award ceremony at the Miami Touchdown Club, and a heckler in the back was screaming at him, Namath, we're going to kill you in that game, or words to that effect. And he said, no. He had watched game film. I believe it was Wednesday or Thursday before the game, and the more game film he watched, he thought the Jets could play pretty well. They matched up pretty well against the Colts, and he was fed up with that kind of talk, and he said, nope, we're going to win that game. I guarantee it. Of course, he got him in trouble with Weeb Eubank, the coach of the Jets, didn't like bulletin board material being passed out like that, and that wasn't the right thing to say in his mind, but it showed the cockiness and the confidence that Namath had, and as you could see in the game, that the rest of his team had in facing off against the NFL. The first 2 Super Bowls, one bad thing happened in the game, and the AFL kind of got nervous and couldn't perform as well. Super Bowl I, Len Dawson threw an interception, and it was all downhill. He threw his interception in the beginning of the second half, and it was downhill for the Chiefs after that. There was a punt dropped in the Raiders contest, and they fell apart in that game. And, of course, the Packers won handily both of those contests. Well, Weeb Ewbank wanted his team to be confident and wanted to go out there and play like he thought they could play and not let one bad thing turn the whole thing around. And Joe Namath was the key ingredient to that. Joe Namath summarized the confidence that I think the rest of the team felt in performing against the Colts. And he said it out loud, which, again, maybe epitomized more of the thinking of the day, where young people, and he represented the younger generation. Of course, that's why I keep saying young people. He had longer hair that wasn't a crew cut like Earl Morrall and Johnny Unitas had on the Colts sideline. He had longer hair and was of the younger generation and wasn't afraid to speak his mind and answer reporters' questions when they asked him what he thought about things. And so I think it does that's a long-winded answer, but I think it does a lot to talk about what things were going on outside of football during the 1960s. It mirrored that, so the social uprising that you saw across the country with things like civil rights and war protests that were primarily led by young people. Namath did a similar type thing in my mind by standing up to the older team, the establishment team that represented the establishment NFL, and said that we can beat you, and I guarantee we'll beat you.
On that same train of thought, do you see any similarities between what athletes did in the 60s and what athletes are doing today?
I think there are some similarities, because in a lot of people's minds, even though many years have passed since the 60s, a lot of people look at their athletes and say, I want him to perform really well. I'll cheer as loud as I can for him, but I don't want to hear his political stance, and I don't want to see him do things that I might not agree with. And so I think you see that some today with like the kneeling at the anthem and political statements that athletes do before games, maybe by wearing a T-shirt that says something on it. I think you see people get a little upset when they see athletes do that. But I think you see those smaller protests more today than you did during the 60s. You didn't hear much of athletes, especially the early 60s. They weren't free to speak their mind, but that was starting to change towards the later part of the 60s. And then I think you see I don't know if you'd say it was commonplace today. It seems like it's more commonplace today for athletes to take stands on social issues or issues that are happening in the world today.
No question about that. Talking to Patrick Gallivan, the author of Pro Football in the 1960s, the NFL, the AFL, and the sports coming of age. And Patrick, I'll get you out on this. Can you lay out the finer points of the AFL-NFL merger?
Okay, so what was happening, we talked a little bit briefly before that both leagues had signed big contracts that funded their coffers, so they were able to spend some money. So we got to the middle part of the 60s, and the competition for players heated up. The AFL strategy early on was not to take players from the other league. They were hoping to win the war on the college players and sign more of the better, younger players and let them develop into the stars rather than reaching across and try to grab a superstar from the other league. That was their strategy initially. Then the contract started to heat up, and it got very competitive. Namath signed a contract for more than $400,000, which was unheard of in those days. And then you had other star players like Tommy Nobis signed a huge contract. When the Packers signed Jim Grabowski and Donnie Anderson. They spent about $1 million combined between those two players. And, of course, they were making a whole lot more than Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung had ever made with the Packers. So things were heating up, and most of the old-time owners said, we can't do this. We can't tolerate this kind of spending year after year. It'll drive us out of business. We can't afford to spend this much on the players that were spending. Of course, the contracts, it was a good TV contract that both leagues had signed, but still nowhere near the TV contracts that they get today. And so that drove some of them to sit down and say, we got to end this, we got to draw a truce. And that's how the merger meetings initially started to happen. Some of the first ones you hear about quite often are Lamar Hunt, who still lived in Dallas, met with Tex Schramm, who was with the Dallas Cowboys, their general manager, and started some of the preliminary talks. They met at the statue, the Texas Rangers statue at Love Field, and then took their meeting out in the car in the parking lot and started some of the preliminary talks that went towards the merger. And it got moving pretty fast once we saw some of these contracts happen. The other thing that happened in the league is the AFL commissioner initially was Joe Foss, who was a World War II fighter pilot and a politician. He was governor of South Dakota. But his reign, so to speak, over the AFL was relatively calm. He kept that strategy that I talked about earlier, where they would just look for younger players and try to compete for the college talent and the hope that they would develop. But he wasn't going out to raid players. Well, in the middle of the decade, remember we talked a little bit about, too, the Giants and the Jets. Well, the Jets' Scott Namath took the headlines away from the Giants. Well, the Giants wanted to do something in return, and they went and signed the best kicker in the AFL, Pete Gogolak, who was a soccer-style kicker. Most kickers in those days were straight-on kickers, and most often they played another position like tackle or end or running back and did the kicking as kind of a sidelight. Well, Gogolak was a specialist, one of the first specialists, and he was a soccer-style kicker, as I said, doing really well with Bills. And the Giants signed him away, and the league then put Al Davis in charge as a commissioner, and Foss left, and that started. Al Davis, what I didn't say earlier, I know he loved speed, but he also was a big fan of military history, and he took that as Gogolak signing as like the opening shot, and this was now war. And so he kind of almost declared war against the NFL, and they went and signed future contracts with a lot of stars like John Brody with the 49ers and Roman Gabriel with the Rams. And that got the many of the NFL owners saying, okay, we got to end this. They're out after all of our best players, our best quarterbacks, and we have to end this fighting over all the top talent, especially at ever increasing salaries. And that's what drove them to the bargaining table. And there was a merger between the two leagues, and they agreed on the common draft, and they agreed that Rozelle would be commissioner over both leagues, because they still called them both leagues at that point, and they would move forward again with the championship game and the Super Bowl and all the merger things that happened in the middle of the 60s that brought us to the Super Bowl I in Los Angeles with the Packers and the Chiefs.
All right, Patrick, thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks. Great to be on with you.
All right, that was Patrick Gallivan. His book is Pro Football in the 1960s, the NFL, the AFL, and the Sports Coming of Age. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. Tomorrow, probably the Trifecta. I don't foresee anything big happening. there are rumblings that the owners are confident that there's going to be something happening when it comes to baseball. I don't know how true that is. I mean, a 50-game schedule implemented unilaterally by the commissioner, the players should draw a line in the sand and say, we don't want to partake in that mockery. Oh, God. Until tomorrow, I am Jacob Valk saying that playing for Yogi Berra was like playing for your father, but playing for Billy Martin was like playing for your father-in-law.